Coming and welcome. We're delighted to be welcoming Liz from the DNR to talk about her knowledge and experience in planting your garden to attract wildlife. So thanks everybody, whenever you're ready, Liz.
Sounds great. I really appreciate you having me join everybody today, and especially on such a gorgeous day, right? This is kind of the weather that gets us thinking a little bit more about wildlife and birds and migration and spring, right? When we hit that 70-degree day. So my name is Liz Herzmann. I am the wildlife educator for the Department of Natural Resources. My main office is out of Horicon Marsh, so that's where I focus most of my work from. And if you've never been to Horicon Marsh, it is a wonderful location that is a 33,000 acre wetland that is one of the best birding spots in the state of Wisconsin. And I hope you get a chance to come visit us at some point. If you have been to Horicon Marsh, you'll know that there's multiple education centers. We're the one with the big giant woolly mammoth out front, and that is where I work. So I talk all about wildlife and habitat management for the marsh and some of the different areas of southern Wisconsin. I'm also a member of the Horicon Marsh Bird Club. You can't work at Horicon Marsh without knowing, or at least getting a crash course into birding. And I've been at Horicon Marsh now for almost 12 years. And so have a pretty good feel for most of the common birds that you'll see there, and also ways that you can attract them, not just to a large scale habitat like Horicon Marsh, but also to smaller habitats like your backyard. You might also see today another guide pop into the video, like all of us, and through this last year, I'm still working from home, and one of my kiddos is off of school today, so he might be hopping in. He's taking diligent notes right now on what he should be adding to our gardens out back. So he might pop in every once in a while. If you have questions throughout the program, you're welcome to type those into the chat, and then I'll make sure that at the very end of the program, I go through and answer all those questions as well. But if you have something that you just have to ask during the program, just pop in the chat and I'll try and work through that. So we're talking about wildlife, right? And what we can do to bring more to our backyards or our schoolyards, or maybe our library if we've got extra space that could work for that. So when we're thinking about what we have to provide to bring in wildlife, we need three things. So all wildlife has basic needs, including ourselves. And the ones that you can have the most control over are food, shelter, and water. And so if you can work with those three basic needs in your yard, on your property, wherever your space is, you have a really great chance of increasing the diversity and bringing in more wildlife to your area. We're going to start just basically with water. Water is a pretty easy thing that you can add, but there is some upkeep to it. So if you have some sort of a bird bath, that's great. Birds love being able to take a quick little bath, grab a drink of water. The key to having those is making sure that that water is clean at all times. You know, sometimes you get that little algal film at the bottom where it starts turning a little bit of colors on that cement or whatever type of stoneware it is. You want to make sure you give it a good cleaning when you do that. Just like if you have a dog or a cat at home, you always clean out their bowls, right? It's the same thing here. You're feeding and giving water to the birds. So make sure you give it a good cleaning every once in a while, especially in the summer when that water can get warm pretty quickly. Changing it out about once a day is a good bet. So adding that water is a really nice feature. The other thing, if you want to get a little bit more fancy, is finding some way to add water that has either a dripping or running water. There's something about that sound of running water that really brings birds and other wildlife in. And so you'll notice if you add some sort of a waterfall feature or just trickling, or they have drip functions that you can add to your bird baths, just that sound of dripping water will bring in even more birds than if you just have that water in the bird bath. So that's a pretty simple thing, or it could be very simple, or it could be more elaborate, depending on how you want that water feature to be. Keeping it clean and fresh is the key, most definitely. Another thing that you can do is add some shelter. And shelter could be a couple of different things. It could be adding some sort of a nesting box to your property if it has the right habitat, like this bluebird box right here. Or it could be adding in native plants and grasses that have enough structure to it that it creates shelter for birds. Or it could be some native bushes, native trees that are close to your feeders. They need to have some sort of shelter or they're not going to be protected. And sometimes you can double up. So for example, if you put in some native plants and native flowers like we have right here, this is the best of both worlds because you've got nectar and seed heads from the plants, but then it has tall enough structure that the birds can dive in there and feel protected if there's some sort of predator nearby. So sometimes you can double up on your efforts by planting the right things. And we'll go into a lot more detail on some of these native plants a little bit later in the program. Now, one of the questions I always get is, what are we doing to feed the birds? And what's the best types of seed or food for birds? And so we're going to go through some of the ones that we most recommend. And so we'll go through suet, thistle, sunflower seed, jam, oranges, and sugar water for our hummingbirds. You will notice that what is not listed here are those mixed seed bags that you can get from any hardware store. The seed bags that have sunflower seeds and cracked corn and millet, those are really not a great mix if you're trying to bring in the best species possible. Those types of seeds have a lot of filler, it's a lot of junk food, and so it can sometimes bring in our more what we consider junky birds like house sparrows. House sparrows, or the English sparrow, are an invasive species, and they actually can be kind of bullies, and they're not really great for our native birds. So if you can actually feed really good, high quality food, it's going to increase the diversity of birds that you have coming in. So if you're only going to feed one seed when you're setting up your backyard areas, you want to go with a black oil sunflower seed. No mix, no filler, just straight black oil sunflower seed. This is going to give you the best bang for your buck, and it brings in things like cardinals and grosbeaks, all different types of finches, goldfinches, house finches, different types of sparrows, your nuthatches, chickadees. They all love those black oil sunflower seeds. And so it really, really gives you a high diversity, and it also weeds out some of those other birds like starlings and English sparrows that we don't like seeing in our backyards because they can be aggressive to our native species. Another that you can also put out there is suet. I would recommend this for winter, but not necessarily for summer. So suet is basically some sort of fat that's mixed in with all sorts of different seeds. And in the summer, that fat gets just really ooey gooey, and the birds don't really need it when there's so much natural food out there. So I'd keep suet as more of a winter or cold weather filler for things like nuthatches and chickadees, and a lot of different woodpeckers will eat on this because they need that extra fat source to help them get through the winter. And if any of you are hunters out there, like a deer hunter, you can make your own suet with fat that you get off of an animal that you harvest. We have a lot of people in our area and a lot of our staff that will just take like those sandwich containers and fill it with seed, melt some of the deer fat on top of it, and you've got a homemade suet cake, which is really great for the winter. Another is thistle, or also known as Niger seed. This is a really small, teeny tiny seed, so it's great for some of our birds that have more delicate and thin beaks, our goldfinch or housefinch, our juncos, which are typically winter, redpoll, pine siskin. So thistle is a great winter feeding aspect for you because it really caters to some of those birds that we see as winter migrants and have those thinner beaks. And you'll notice that if you go to the store, there's a bazillion different feeders. For the thistle or the Niger seed, you'll want what's called a sock feeder. It's just a thin mesh feeder. It has teeny tiny holes in it that the birds can get into and pull out that Niger seed. And that's a really great feeder that you can use for that. Or some of these tube feeders work for it as well. But we really like those sock feeders that they have with the thin mesh around it. So everybody's getting anxious for spring, right? And one of the things that we're all looking forward to is that flash of orange and black of our first orioles coming through. And we're not there yet, but we're not far either. So we always say that the date to put out our jam and our oranges is May 1st. That's when we really start seeing our migrants coming from Central and South America of our orioles. So anything will work. They have a lot of fancy orange feeders and jam feeders in the stores. We've had it work where we've used those feeders and they're great, but we've also just put a bunch of oranges on a pile of rocks we have in our backyard, And the birds love that too. So you can be, again, as sophisticated or as simple as you like with feeding, and that's perfectly fine. So cutting up oranges, grape jam or grape jelly is the favorite, and it's a great food source for our Orioles. And we get quite a few that come into our backyard that really love it. And once you get Orioles that know that you are a feeding source for them, they will keep coming back, and they'll let you know when your food is gone. So, all right. So you might get Orioles, you might get house finches, you may even get a hummingbird. We also had robins eating on our grape jelly every once in a while. So you never know what you're going to get. There we go. The other date, May 1st, is hummingbird feeders. So again, we're all itching. You probably could put them out now just in case there's a rare migrant that might be coming through, but May 1st is the date we usually say get your hummingbird feeders out. You will notice that the picture I have here is, one of those traditional hummingbird feeders that you see. It's red and then has those yellow flowers. Those are the two colors you really want to see in your hummingbird feeders. It's what attracts them. This one, however, has a red dyed hummingbird feeder, which is fairly common. However, it's something we don't recommend anymore. If you think about red dyes and how we don't recommend them to ourselves, to our kids, in a lot of the foods we eat, well, it's the same thing. It's not necessary for hummingbirds, and it's not great for them either. So that you can buy in the store, they have a lot of nectar, pre-made nectar now that is uncolored. So you can buy that, or you could make your own nectar as well. So you can take 4 cups of water, 1 cup of sugar, boil it together, and just make sure it all gets dissolved, and that's it. It's a 4-to-1 ratio, super simple, really easy, really cheap, and you can fill up your feeders with whatever you make. If you have a little bit left over, you can just store it in the fridge for about a week, so you can continue to refill as needed. And depending on the temperatures out there, will basically dictate when you change your feeders. If it's starting to get really hot, 80s, 90s, and you see that your nectar is getting like a cloudy or a yellowish color or tint, you're going to want to change that out, because it means that that sugar water is starting to go bad, and we don't want to be feeding them either. Or sometimes we get ants that go in there too, just kind of give it a little bit of a cleaning. So keep that in mind, is that if it starts getting really hot in the summer, you're going to want to change your nectar a little bit faster. And same thing with Orioles as it is with hummingbirds. If they find that you're a place that has lots and lots of food, they are going to keep coming back all year and year after year. Hummingbirds have this amazing site fidelity where they can remember exactly where they find good food, and they will come back year after year. For an example, this picture in the bottom right is a rufous hummingbird, which is a rare Western migrant that we actually had show up at our house a number of years ago. And we had somebody come out from the Milwaukee Zoo to band it, and then it went on its way. And lo and behold, the next summer, that same hummingbird came back, and we knew it was the same one because it was banded. So this thing was going all over the world, down into the Central Americas, and it still remembered our little house in Mayville, and that we had food for it, and it came back, which was pretty amazing. So these birds, if you give them good food, they will come back, and they'll remember, and they'll stake out good places. The thing you have to remember as well, though, is that when you're providing food for the birds, you're also providing food for the birds, right? So you might have predators that are coming in. There are many hawks and raptors that live in our little cities or out in the country that feed on other birds. And so you just have to be okay and realize that you might have something like this Cooper's hawk that will be staking out your bird feeder, and they might go after some of the birds you've been trying so hard to feed. But remember, it is a giant food web, and everything has to eat at some point in time. So we do have some of those raptors, those predators that might be staking out your bird feeders as well. Even some owls if you're really lucky. There's an owl flying behind me right now. So those are the things that you can do when you're physically feeding food to our birds. One of the other things that I really believe strongly in is just putting in native landscaping to your backyards. And that can be something really simple, just a small little postage stamp of an area, or it could be a larger couple acres, depending on what your situation is. The reason that native landscaping is so great is because all of these native plants These are plants that are meant to be in this area. They're specifically adapted to our climate, to our soil, and they're what would have been here 100, 200 years ago. And so they don't require much maintenance. They're really easy to take care of. They reseed themselves each year, or they spread through roots, and their roots reach super far into the ground. There's some really great graphics of root systems for grass, just our normal turf grass, which is about this far, and then comparing it to all the different prairie plants, and some of them are going 14 feet deep into the ground. So there's actually more plant below the ground than there is above the ground, which is pretty phenomenal. So they're very drought tolerant, and you don't have to do a lot of watering because their root system is so sophisticated compared to others. Plus, it's amazing for just all sorts of different wildlife, pollinators, hummingbirds, butterflies, you name it, they're going to love native plants. And so why is it our job to put these native plants out there? Well, number one, a lot of that native habitat is disappearing, and it has been very, very quickly for a long time. And so these grasses are super critical for all of our native insects and pollinators and wildlife, because they really need that food source. Many of our birds and butterflies are dependent on specific native species and native plants, and without them, they will not survive. Obviously, the monarch is probably one of the keystone species that you can think of, with the combo of milkweeds and monarch, that if those milkweed plants are gone, well, so does the monarch. It goes as well. The other issue we have is a lot of non-native invasive species that are taking over. I'm sure just about anywhere you go in our southern part of the state, you're going to see something like garlic mustard or buckthorn or wild parsnip that can really just take over an area, which means our native plants don't have a chance to survive. So if we can do every little bit, it's going to make a difference at some point. So I'm going to go through a couple of different types of gardens that we might have in our area. And we are going to talk through some different plants that might be good as well, knowing that there's a whole host of other options out there. So I'm going to take you to a house that we used to live in the middle of Mayville, which is right near Horicon Marsh, and just show you a couple of different plants that we put in that are natives and really had an impact on us and the wildlife that we brought in. This is a little less than quarter-acre lot that we had. So just to showcase that it can be done in small areas and it can be done easily and well. So here we just have a little bit of a shade garden, really simple edging. We put in some native viburnums, which get wonderful flowers for our pollinators, but then they get some native berries as well. And they're always loaded with things like cedar waxwings and bluebirds once those berries came, and they had them picked clean pretty quickly. And these got much bigger, so they are also a type of screen for us as well. So it worked out quite nicely. And there's a lot of really great natives that are shade tolerant. That's one of the things that you want to look for, depending on what your property looks like, what your sunlight is looking like. Is it an area that's mostly shaded? Does it get dappled sunlight? Is it partial, or is it all sun? Because the plants you plant are going to be really dependent on that. So here's just a couple of examples of some of our woodland plants. We've got Columbine and Shooting Star in there, and these are all mostly spring ephemerals, which means they bloom for a couple weeks, maybe a month in the spring, and then they will basically die back. Some of them keep the green foliage so that you have some ground cover, others don't, but it's a really super important early pollinator plant. And if you think about it, one of the things we always say is keep the dandelions, don't spray them, because it's one of the few things that's blooming in the spring for all of our early pollinators. Same thing with some of these spring ephemerals. If you want to really provide for those early pollinators, some of those little bumblebees that are coming out, this is a great opportunity for that. So here's a couple that we love putting in our yard. We have Shooting Star. These are a beautiful plant that have these rocket-shaped flowers. Bloodroot, which is really amazing. They have a leaf that curls around the stem. They have a red tint to the sap in their stems, and then they get these nice little white flowers that bloom for about a week. And I just saw my first bloodroot yesterday, so they are starting to come in our woodlots. And then Spiderwort is another really fun plant. They get all these little bulbs, and then they bloom for a day, and then they're done. But you can get a lot of color out of them, and it can spread fairly quickly by seed if you're looking to move it through an area. So this is a little bit closer up of the Spiderwort. They're leaves are very grass-like and they have a sticky sap in there, but these are a really nice one and they will spread a little bit quickly. So you might want to keep them contained a little bit to where they are, but they're a wonderful plant. And if you cut those full bulbs of flowers off, if you deadhead them, you can get another blooming a little bit later into the summer as well, which is nice. Looks good. Another really nice one is wild geranium. This is one that keeps a nice ground cover. You get, probably a good 3 to 4 weeks of blooming. They can do well in shade, but also do really well in sun. You can get almost bush-like, you can see here. And this is about a May bloom time, but then they keep some of that nice foliage and that ground cover for more shady areas if you're interested in that. And then Columbine, this can be a nice loamy soil. I found it in rocky soils quite a bit. And that red-yellow combination, if you can imagine, is really great for our hummingbirds, especially some of those really early ones that are coming back that maybe are coming back before that May 1st date and we don't have our feeders out quite yet. So Columbine's a great plant to mix into your shade gardens as well. Another type of garden that you can certainly put into your backyard to increase your wildlife are rain gardens. And these are beneficial not just for the wildlife, but it also helps you out. It decreases the amount of water that is running into our streets and into our storm drains. It allows your soil to filter more water and it recharges our local aquifers. It keeps any of that polluted source from going into our lakes and our streams. And it really can just add to the beauty of our yards and then obviously that really great habitat. So this is a small rain garden that we put in at that same house. We basically tiled in this drain spout right here. We buried it underneath, and you always want to go at least 10 feet away from your house because if something happens with that tile, you do not want water pooling around your foundation. That's not a good thing. So make sure that you're doing a lot of measurements with this. Later on, I'll pop a resource into the chat that is how to make a rain garden that the Wisconsin DNR has come up with, and it's really fantastic. I highly recommend it. But we basically just tiled it in and then created this berm along the outside. So if we had some overflow, it wouldn't be as bad if we got a really heavy downpour. And then there's also measurements in that how-to guide of how big you should make it depending on the square footage of your roof, because all of our houses are different sizes and you want to try to make sure that it is the proper size to catch the amount of water that would be coming down. This is a rain garden that we put in spring of 2011. We just had a handful of plants that we got from some coworkers and we bought from some native plant sales. And you can see there's some water that's already working. So we knew our tiling system was doing well. If you get plugs, it can definitely increase your bloom time as far as how fast those plants bloom. So we had some iris in here. This is swamp milkweed. There's sneezeweed. That's all blooming in that first year. Blue flag iris is one of my favorites. It blooms fairly early and it can create these really nice clumps of these beautiful bluish purple flowers in your rain gardens, and they get some different colorations. You can see the deeper violet and then that super light blue as well that comes into those flowers. Swamp milkweed is a great one. It's also known as red milkweed. It is a milkweed, which means monarch caterpillars love it. And we always find some on these plants. Their leaves are much narrower than the common milkweed that you think of. And these guys like their feet wet. They like to have a little bit swampier areas or wetter areas. So this would be the plant to plant if you got some soupy areas in your yard, as opposed to the common milkweed. And then of course they get that beautiful pollinator attractant flower, and then they'll get much narrower seed pods than the common milkweed. Michigan lily and Joe-Pyeweed are also really nice native plants. Joe-Pyeweed is just a pollinator magnet. As soon as this stuff goes into bloom, they are always just loaded with all sorts of different insects and butterflies. It is a wonderful, wonderful plant to put in your rain gardens, and it will bring in a huge host of different types of pollinators as you're coming through. And then of course the Michigan lily here just gives that pop of a different color. You don't see too many oranges in native plants, but this is a really great option. And then blue vervain. This is a beautiful plant. It gets these spiky flowers and the flowers just kind of keep creeping up, 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 up and up. And again, it's just a pollinator magnet and just a really unique looking plant that can spread pretty quickly in your rain garden. So it's a nice one to fill in the gaps a little bit more quickly. And it can get pretty tall. I had some that were 6 or 7 feet tall in really good soil. So just keep that in mind when you're looking at the plants you're putting in. Keep an eye on what their height is, and if you're looking to keep things shorter, just keep that in mind too. So this is the how-to manual. I'll pop this link in the chat in just a little bit so that you've got that resource as well, but it's a really, really great one. So another type of native garden that you can put in is a prairie garden. And a prairie garden, when I refer to that, I mean basically a garden that's seen full sun for almost the entire day. So these are not going to be tolerant of wet conditions. They will not be tolerant of any type of shade. These are your true prairie plants with a lot of sunshine, and probably historically would see more drought conditions. And so this is the prairie garden that we put in. You can see the rain gardens here, and then we surrounded it with prairie and along the outside. And we just started again with some different plugs that we got from native plant sales and from a couple of coworkers that we snagged some from their backyards. And so this was the spring of 2011 putting that in. We wood chipped it, mulched it in to try and help keep some of the moisture in, but we had to do very little watering except for if it got, you know, super, super warm. Otherwise, these plants were pretty good all on their own. And within that first summer, many of them were already flowering. So again, if you put plugs in, there is a good chance that they may flower even in that first year. These yellow plants that you see in the background, this is an oxeye sunflower. They are great for filling in areas quickly, and they'll grow very profusely as well, and a great native plant. So this is the fall of 2011. You can see those plants have really done well. Many of them are blooming, like these black-eyed Susans and our New England Aster. So here's the summer of 2012. I'm not sure if all of you remember, but summer of 2012 was a major drought year. We had not a lot of rain that year. So I show you this picture here because this is our rain garden and our prairie garden in year 2. This is the rest of our yard. I mean, it was that crunchy brown where you're just not sure if that grass is going to come back. And so I just want to showcase the difference between those root systems. So these plants we didn't water at all, and they had a strong enough root system and a deep enough root system. They were going down into that water table and grabbing whatever that they needed. And so they were lush, they were blooming, they were doing just fine. Our grass was not. So really showcases how beneficial those native plants can be, especially in drought conditions. So here it is in 2013, and the reason I'm showing you progression in years is because one of those things about prairie gardens is it's not just like an annual garden where you plant it, it blooms great, and it looks beautiful that first year. It might take a little bit of time. Sometimes a native prairie garden is going to take 2, 3, 4, 5 years to really fill in and look great depending on what you're doing. And so, you know, we're talking 3 years down the road and we're finally getting those really nice blooms throughout the summer coming in. And so it will take a little bit of time, but I guarantee you your patience will pay off and you're going to love what your prairie garden looks like. And you can see now these big plants are really filling in. We didn't add much to what we had originally put in, maybe a plug here or there of just a new species that we wanted to add. But for the most part, this is everything from those couple of original plugs that have just seeded themselves in. And so now it's just this lush garden of wildflowers. It's a pollinator magnet. It's full of birds. It's wonderful. And it's only a couple of years later. So it is worth the wait when you're putting in these gardens. I guarantee you that. And so this is, let's see here, 6 years after we put it in. So you can see really, really filled in. And it did that all on its own naturally, which is great. So a couple of the plants that we put in our gardens, not just personally at our house, but also what we have native growing around the Horicon Marsh area and do pretty well in most of the southern part of Wisconsin. Once you get into the southern southwest part where it's a little more sandy, then you want to look at some different plants. But purple prairie clover, this is a great plant. I do caution you, however, if you have stubborn rabbits in your yard, these are a fan favorite. So we've had many negative conversations in our house about rabbits that have been eating my purple prairie clover. So just be aware you might want to, if you're doing this as just a showcase plant, put a little bit of wiring around it to protect it. But once you do have this going, it is just loaded with bumblebees. You can see they're covered, their pollen sacs are completely full. They absolutely love these plants that we have. Wild white indigo is a really interesting showcase piece. They get these asparagus looking stalks in the spring, and then they shoot up to 5 or 6 feet tall with these amazing indigo and whitish flowers, depending on the species that you get. And then it's a legume. So you've got these seed pods that are basically like pea pods that will come off the plant. So really interesting showcase piece. These can take a little bit to get established, sometimes 3 or 4 years, but once they go, they're a really cool looking plant that you can have as a showcase in your prairie. Butterfly weed is a really great one. This is a type of milkweed, and it's an orange color, which again, we don't get in our native species too often. And so this is a great one to put in. They like a little drier soils, and they have seeds that are adapted for clay soils. So if you're looking for natives, some of the native seed companies will have butterfly weed for clay soils. So keep an eye out for that one specifically. They've basically gone out and find butterfly weed that is in a clay soil, and they've specifically taken those seeds and brought those back. So pretty interesting stuff. This is an oxeye sunflower I talked a little bit about earlier. It really grows in about anything, and it grows well. So if you're looking to establish just anything and quickly, these are great plants to put in as filler, and they'll go year after year after year and just keep filling in really nicely for a lot of our pollinators. Wild bergamot's a great one. It's a Monarda. You might have seen this as well with some different colorations. This is the true native with this palish purple color, and the leaves you can use as a tea. They're in the mint family, so they've got that little bit of a minty flavor. And these can get pretty tall and pretty bush-like, and when these are all in full bloom, there are bumblebees galore on these. They really absolutely love it. We've had multiple species of bumblebees on our bergamot. I think everybody's familiar with purple coneflower. There's a number of different coneflowers in the Echinacea family. We've got yellow coneflower. We've got pale purple coneflower, which is the true native to our area, and a variety of different ones. And these are pretty common for our native prairies. Here's our yellow coneflower, a little bit more droopy and less of a spiky center. And they can really naturalize quickly, and they will spread from seed fairly quickly. So if you're planting seed, this is a great one to add in that will establish itself fairly quickly with just seed. All right, another one that's really great, and some people will say this is the top plant for wildlife because it provides food, water, and shelter, is cup plant. It's got food with the flowers as nectar, but also the birds go crazy for their seeds. It provides water because the leaves basically form a cup along the stem, and dew will drip in there or rainwater, and so you'll see a lot of birds coming to drink from these little cups on the plant. And they can get very tall, 6, 7, 8 feet. So they provide a lot of structure and a lot of shelter for birds out there. So just be aware, if you do plant these, they do get tall. So it's great for back border, and they also can spread relatively quickly once they get established. So if you want big stands of cup plants, that is certainly a possibility for you. Along the same lines as cup plant is compass plant. These leaves are said to grow on the north and the south side of the stem. Sometimes they switch a little bit, but that's how they got their name. And they get these big stems full of these beautiful sunshine, sunflower-like flowers. When they get really established as a plant, you can have up to 100 flowers on a single plant. And so you can imagine it's a great food source and great shelter for many of our plants out there. Another unique one that we have in our prairies around our education center is wild quinine. And it gets these pearly white flowers, and it's just exceptional, and it is very unique and different looking out there. And true to name, it was used as a supplement for quinine in World War II when they ran out of the bark from the cinchona tree. So this was something that was used historically for some medicinal purposes as well. Prairie blazing star is a beautiful, beautiful flower that really likes sunshine and drier areas. They get these feather duster-like flowers, and the purple just keeps going up, 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 up. So they bloom for long periods of time. And again, these purple flowers just attract all sorts of pollinators. They're usually just loaded with insects, and you can tell that they're getting in there pretty easily. Black-eyed and brown-eyed Susan are both fairly common in many of our cultivated prairie plants. You'll see those a lot in the stores, and these are typically a biennial, so they won't flower necessarily the first year from seed. They'll flower the next year, they'll drop a ton of seed, and then they'll just keep repeating that process over and over again. So if you get them established every year, you should have good blooming, and then they'll reseed themselves every single year. This is a fun one. This is Rattlesnake Master, and it looks like a yucca with the leaves. They're very stiff compared to many of our other leaves. And then they get this rattlesnake looking flower with these itty bitty little white flowers. And the interesting part is this particular plant can actually host and support more insect species than some of our other pollinators. So there's some really great research by Professor Doug Tallamy. If anybody's ever heard of him, he has written the book Bring Nature Home, and he found that this plant supports 185 insect species. 185 just with Rattlesnake Master. That's just mind-blowing right there. And things like pale purple coneflower are only in the 50s, I think. It was quite a bit lower. So planting natives can be really, really beneficial. There's some other really great research on like oak trees, and they can support over 500 different types of caterpillar species as compared to some of our orientals like ginkgos that only support about 5. So it's just really interesting research out there. Another great native prairie plant is New England Aster. And this is a really nice plant for fall. We always think of our native prairies as summer blooms, right? And that's when we think of all those amazing colors and the prairies just seas of yellow. But we don't want to forget about our late pollinators, right? We talked about our spring ephemerals for our early pollinators, but we don't want to forget about those late ones either. And so New England asters and goldenrods are wonderful plants to put out there for these migrants that are coming through even into October and early November, because they still need a food source desperately as they're coming through. And New England Aster is a great one. And you can see they've got different color variations. So some of them are a little bit more lavender, others are a little bit deeper purple. So you'll get some variation in there, which will be fun. And you'll notice that once you put in all these native plants, the insects are the first thing they're going to tell you you're doing a good job. You're going to find honeybees, you're going to find bumblebees, you'll find all sorts of different dragonflies and damselflies and butterflies. And when you start noticing that, you're going to know that you're doing a good job. And many of our birds are insect eaters, especially when they are feeding their young. It's not seeds that they're feeding their young for the most part, it is insects. And so if you can provide habitat that is providing tons and tons of insects for our birds, you're going to have a much better chance of those birds nesting on your property as well. So insects are the key. And then once you've got the insects, birds, right? Lots and lots of birds. These are just a handful of species that we had from that little quarter-acre property in Mayville. So we had bluebirds nesting in our yard. We had pine warblers, hummingbirds coming through in our cardinal flower, grosbeak. So you name it, we found it because we provided just enough variety to bring in all sorts of different things. So we had black-throated green warblers, cedar waxwings, white-crowned sparrows. So if you plant it, they will come, I can guarantee you. And you'll have so much fun figuring out what sort of great plants you have there. So we at Horicon Marsh, every year we do a wildflower sale. It's called Wildflowers for Wildlife. And we did just finish up with our pre-orders, and we were just going to do a pre-order sale this year due to COVID, but we have found a location that's going to let us do an actual in-person sale this year, which is what we have typically done pre-COVID. And that's going to be at Marsh Haven Nature Center. So we haven't finalized all the details, but just a sneak peek, it will be on this date, May 15th at Marsh Haven Nature Center. You can keep an eye on our friends group webpage, which is horiconmarsh.org. And we should be having a full-blown native plant sale up there, which is really great. So if there's any of these plants that you saw that you're like, I could use some of those in my yard, we'll probably have those up there for you and in smaller batches. So if you just want 2 or 3, we can do that as opposed to our pre-orders, which are big flats of these plants. So I hope you gained a little bit of information on different plants that you could put in your backyards in different variety of ways, whether it's shade or rain gardens or prairie gardens. And just know there's a lot more resources out there, and there's a lot of really great and amazing seed companies that sell native plants, both seed and the plugs themselves. And they're very reputable and give really great resources as well. So our education center is closed right now. However, all of our trails are open, and we certainly hope that you get a chance to come visit us. We're hoping our Explorium will be open at some point in time, and you can come learn a little bit about the history of Horicon Marsh. But until then, I am certainly here to answer any questions that you might have. I saw there were some in the chat, so I can stop sharing for just a second and hop in there. But I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have about native plants that are in there. So give me a second to just, okay, so the recipe for hummingbirds is a 4 parts water. I'll put it in the chat too. So 4 cups water with 1 cup sugar, and then just boil so that it dissolves. And that is it. It's pretty easy. All right, I think that was most of the questions. Any others? Yep, you can certainly do the math on there, Jane. Oh yes, the rain garden link. I will be sure to get that. Hold on a moment. Oh, okay, so I just put that rain garden link. Can natives be used in containers? Absolutely. So we know that not everybody has a backyard that they can put rain gardens, or excuse me, prairie plants in. So container gardening is absolutely possible. I've got 2 pollinator container gardens at our house where, you know, you just take a small container and you can put a whole variety in there depending on how large that container is, and it will do wonderful. The roots will obviously just be a little bit more stunted, which means the plants will be a little bit more stunted, but they're still going to do wonderful. And they're going, sometimes people like that a little bit better as well. And so that's really, really beneficial. And so we have lots of different container gardens, like lettuce in our house as well. So we love container gardens in our house. And so, yeah, if you just have an apartment or an area that doesn't have a huge backyard or just a driveway, you can absolutely use native plants in container gardening. So the bird seed and feeders cause weeds to grow from the uneaten seeds. It can sometimes, yes. Sometimes you'll get little sunflowers that are growing underneath. So just keep that in mind and where your placement is for your bird feeders. Usually the birds are pretty good, but sometimes they can get messy depending on the species that are coming in. And so it's always helpful that if you're putting up your bird feeders, try to put it over an area that you have a really well-established grass already, so that if anything starts coming up, it's not that big of a deal, and you just mow it down anyways. But for the most part, it's not too bad. If you're putting your feeders over a dirt area or where it's just wood chips or something, then yeah, you're going to get a ton of weeds coming up or small sunflowers. So try to put it over an area that's either cement or, you know, if you're just around a patio, or well-established grass is what I would recommend. Do I ever need to cut back our prairie garden? We haven't yet. We always just let it go, and we don't really cut too much of the stems off either. We will transplant some of it if we start seeing that there's some areas that are just getting really thick. We'll transplant it to other areas, or we'll give it to friends or coworkers that are looking for it. But we typically don't cut it back very much. They're not cut back in nature, so we kind of let it go as it's needed. So a question was, are cultivars of natives beneficial? And I guess the answer is yes and no. It really depends on who you're talking to. You know, some of the people that are true native enthusiasts will say, nope, it's got to be natives and natives only, because even the cultivars are bringing in combinations that wildlife is not necessarily used to. But we also say that anything out there that produces nectar and seed is something that's going to be beneficial as well. I have to look it up. There is some really great research that I came across a couple of years ago where it was comparing native cultivars to the true native, and what birds were using it, what insects were using it. And I think it was a little bit less, but it was decently comparable. So you can certainly use those as well. Deer resistant prairie plants that can be used in an unfenced area around a home. Sure. So what I would recommend, and here I'll try and get this in the chat quickly. There are a couple of really great native seed companies that, hold on, I'm finding it really quick. So Prairie Nursery is one of my favorites. We order a lot of our seed for our education center from there, and their plant lists and their plant pages are just so robust. They have so much information there, including if they are deer resistant or not. So what I would do is I would kind of scroll through their pages, and they also have just some links on there that say specifically like plants for mound systems, or plants for clay, or plants that are deer resistant. And so they have those kind of labeled out. And so you can look at some of those different plants that are really great for deer resistance, and it's wonderful. So I would certainly take a look at that as far as what you would recommend, or you can just email them and they have great recommendations for that as well. But there's so many different choices because there's a lot more out there than what I just listed. So you might want to see something different than what you have. So Joanne, the question was, do bees overwinter in last year's stems? Yes, they can. So that's one of the reasons that we don't recommend on that first 50-degree day, everybody going and cleaning out all their gardens. We all want to, right? Like that's what we want to do, is we're itching for spring. But there are many insects that are overwintering still, whether it's in the stems or in the leaves that we might have laying in our yard still. And so the recommendation now is to wait for us to have like 50 to 55-degree weather for at least a 7 to 10 day stretch, because then they're going to start moving and emerging and everything, and then you can clean up your garden. So we're getting pretty close to that point. We've had a pretty long stretch of warm weather, so we should be in good shape there. But yeah, that's always a big question, and kind of some new research that's come out that is just wait. As much as we want to clean up those gardens, give it a chance, because then you're going to give your native pollinators a little bit more of a chance as well. You have a family member allergic to bees. There's some good foliage plants. Okay, so if you have someone who's allergic to bees, yeah, you may want to avoid some of those true forbs, right? The flowers. So there's a lot of also really excellent grasses that are out there. Things like little blue stem, big blue stem, Indian grass, prairie drop seed. These are all wonderful plants that give a lot of structure and are very dynamic in your gardens. And they also provide those seed heads that are great for our wildlife as well. So there's definitely a lot of grass-like foliage that you can put in there that would deter bees from congregating in your area. Yeah, I know that's hard because, you know, when we're thinking about natives, we think pollinators first, but some people may not want pollinators in their yard, especially if they have an allergy like that. So there are other options out there for you, most definitely. Native shrubs, yes. So Prairie Nursery and some of the others, Prairie Moon is another one. They have some really great resources for native shrubs, anything like service berries or viburnums. There's snowberry. There's a lot of great options that are non-native, or excuse me, are native shrubs, but also produce flowers and berries for a lot of our birds that are coming through on migration. So there is certainly a good number of native shrubs. Dogwoods are another amazing resource and can come in all different shapes and sizes depending on what your habitat is like. So there are absolutely native shrubs that would be worthwhile if you're looking for more of a hedgerow or that type of thing. So definitely be on the lookout for those. All right, I'm just going back through the chat. I think I captured most of your questions that came in. Yeah, I think I grabbed everything. So I'm hoping that everybody's itching to get outside and put a couple native plants in their areas, or put up some bird feeding stations or some watering stations. Remember, the key is food, water, and shelter, right? We want to give them the best food, water, and shelter that we can in any way we can, and in the best combination we can. And that's going to look different across everybody's yard, you know, depending on if you're an apartment in a small subdivision lot, or if you're out in the country where you've got a couple acres. This is all going to look different, and there's a lot of resources out there, especially with natives. Any of these native seed companies are super, super anxious to work with people, and they have an amazing working knowledge of what plants go best for different areas. So never hesitate to reach out to any of those folks. They're certainly willing to help with that. So really appreciate everybody joining me, especially on this beautiful afternoon. Get out there and do some gardening this afternoon and enjoy the warm temperatures before the rain comes. So thanks again for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Liz. Have a great afternoon, everyone.